What would you do if a game you were playing started playing you instead? Not in the way that a good game hooks you, consumes your time, and makes you forget the outside world. No, I'm talking about a game that knows you, really knows you, your fears, your secrets, your past. A game that can reach out from behind the screen and take hold of your life, piece by piece, until you're no longer sure where the game ends and you begin. That's exactly the kind of nightmare my friends and I stumbled into. It all began on a Saturday afternoon, one of those unremarkable days where nothing was supposed to happen. We'd planned to meet up at my place, as we often did, to spend the day playing video games, eating junk food, and escaping the dullness of our small-town lives. Our group was tight-knit, bound together by years of shared experiences, inside jokes, and a mutual love of gaming. There was Mike, the joker of the group, Sarah, the quiet but sharp-witted one, Jenna, the outgoing fearless one, Tony, the tech-savvy skeptic, and me, James, the guy who always seemed to find himself in the middle of things. This day, though, would be different. It was the day we found the cartridge. I'd been rummaging through the attic, looking for my old SNES console. My dad had passed it down to me, and it had been a while since I'd dusted it off. The attic was a mess, boxes stacked haphazardly, filled with old clothes, forgotten toys, and the detritus of a life lived and left behind. That's when I spotted it, an old cardboard box shoved into a corner, half covered by a moth-eaten blanket. Curiosity got the better of me, and I dragged the box into the light. Inside, among some old comics and a few outdated VHS tapes, was a small, unmarked cartridge. No label, no branding, just a plain gray piece of plastic, slightly worn and forgotten. "Guys, check this out," I called down to the others, who were sprawled out on the basement couch, waiting for me to bring down the SNES. They gathered around as I came down, holding the cartridge like it was some sort of relic. In a way, it was, "What's that?" Mike asked, eyeing the cartridge suspiciously. "I have no idea," I admitted, turning it over in my hands. It was in my dad's old stuff. No label or anything. "Could be a bootleg game?" Tony suggested, leaning in for a closer look. "Or maybe some rare, unlicensed thing." Jenna grinned. "Or maybe it's a hidden gem. Let's try it out." Sarah, ever the cautious one, hesitated. "Are you sure it's safe? I mean, that thing looks ancient." "Come on, it's just a game," Mike said, rolling his eyes. "What's the worst that could happen?" We should have listened to Sarah. We should have left that cartridge in the attic, buried under decades of dust and forgetfulness. But we didn't, and by the time we realized our mistake, it was already too late. Back in the basement, we hooked up the SNES to the old TV, the one that had seen better days but still worked well enough for our gaming sessions. The TV buzzed to life with a faint hum, its screen flickering as I slotted the cartridge into the console. There was a moment of hesitation, a brief flicker of doubt, but then the game started up. The screen stayed black for longer than I expected, and for a moment, I thought the cartridge might be broken. But then, slowly, the darkness gave way to a simple, pixelated title screen. The words, "The Game," appeared in a crude, glitchy font that looked as if it had been hastily slapped together by an amateur programmer. No intro, no music, just the stark words on the screen. "Not exactly AAA quality, is it?" Mike quipped, grabbing the controller from the floor. "Maybe it's some kind of prototype," Tony suggested, his techie mind racing to figure out what we were dealing with. I shrugged. "Only one way to find out." Mike pressed start, and the screen faded to black again. This time, it stayed black for what felt like an eternity. The only sound in the room, the faint hum of the TV and our own breathing. Then, without warning, the screen burst to life, revealing a character creation screen that was surprisingly detailed for such a crude-looking game. There were 5 character slots, each one displaying a blank shadowy figure waiting to be customized. But as we cycled through the options, something unsettling began to emerge. The avatars, they looked like us. Not in the way that a generic character might resemble you if you squinted hard enough, but in an eerie, exact way. The avatars mimicked our facial features, our hairstyles, even the clothes we were wearing that day. "This is messed up," Jenna said, breaking the silence. "How is this even possible?" Tony muttered, his brow furrowed in confusion. This cartridge must be ancient. There's no way it has face mapping technology. Maybe it's just a coincidence, Sarah offered, though she didn't sound convinced. But despite our growing unease, curiosity got the better of us. I selected the avatar that looked like me and started customizing it. The options were limited, basic things like hair color, skin tone, and clothes, but everything felt eerily familiar. When I was done, the avatar on the screen was a perfect replica of me, down to the smallest detail. All right, who's next? I asked, passing the controller to Tony. One by one, we each created our characters, and with every completed avatar, the tension in the room grew. By the time Jenna finished hers, we were all staring at the screen in silence. There we were, pixelated versions of ourselves, standing in a lineup, waiting for whatever the game had in store. Mike broke the silence with a nervous laugh. All right, let's see what this thing is all about. He pressed the button to start the game, and the screen shifted to a top-down view of a small pixelated town. The graphics were basic, reminiscent of old 16-bit RPGs, but there was something off about the place. The colors were washed out, the buildings were slightly distorted, and the music, if you could call it that, was a low, unsettling hum that seemed to resonate deep in our bones. This place gives me the creeps, Sarah said, her eyes fixed on the screen. Yeah, no kidding, Jenna agreed. But where are we supposed to go? The town was eerily empty, with no NPCs in sight, no quests or objectives. Just the five of us, wandering through a ghost town that seemed to stretch on forever. We split up, each taking a different direction, hoping to find something, anything that would make sense of the game. That's when things started to get personal. As we explored the town, strange things began to happen. The town's layout started to change, subtly at first, then more drastically. Streets twisted and turned in impossible directions, leading us back to places we'd already been. Buildings that were once familiar now seemed alien, their walls covered in indecipherable symbols and patterns. The first major event happened when we approached a building that looked suspiciously like our old high school. It wasn't an exact replica. There were differences, little things that didn't quite match up, but it was close enough to send a chill down my spine. Is this our school? Jenna asked, her voice barely a whisper. Looks like it, Tony replied, his eyes scanning the screen. But how could that be? This game is ancient. It shouldn't know anything about us. Maybe it's some kind of glitch? I suggested, though I knew it was a weak explanation. We entered the building, and that's when things got really strange. The hallways were dimly lit, the walls lined with lockers that seemed to stretch on endlessly. As we moved through the corridors, we started encountering things that shouldn't have been there, objects and items that held personal significance to each of us. A poster from the talent show Sarah had won in junior year, a broken watch that Tony had lost years ago, the exact same backpack that Mike had carried throughout high school. These weren't just random objects, they were our memories, somehow rendered in pixels and code. This is impossible, Sarah said, her voice trembling. How does this game know all this? No one had an answer. We were all too unnerved by what we were seeing. The school wasn't just a place in the game. It was a twisted reflection of our past, distorted by something dark and malevolent. The deeper we ventured, the more personal it became. The classrooms were filled with our old test papers, our doodles, even the exact seating arrangements from our final year. It was like the game was digging into our minds, pulling out fragments of our lives and weaving them into its world. Guys, I think we should stop, Jenna said, her usual confidence wavering. This is seriously messed up. But before we could decide, the screen glitched and a message appeared. The game knows you. The game sees you. The words sent a shiver down my spine. I felt like we were being watched, not just by the game, but by something far more sinister lurking within it. We need to get out of here, Tony said, his voice urgent. This isn't just a game anymore. But when we tried to leave the school, we found that the exit was gone. The door we had come through was now a solid wall, pixelated bricks sealing us inside. We're trapped, Mike said, panic creeping into his voice. We're trapped in here. We were forced to keep moving deeper into the school as the game twisted reality around us. The walls seemed to close in, the hallways grew narrower, and the once familiar surroundings became increasingly nightmarish. Then we reached the gymnasium, and that's where we found the first real horror. In the center of the gym, illuminated by a single, flickering light, was a large mirror. It was out of place in the pixelated world, too real, too detailed. It looked like someone had cut a hole in the game and placed a real mirror in its place. We approached it cautiously, our avatars moving in sync with our own hesitant steps. As we got closer, we saw that the reflections in the mirror weren't just our avatars. They were us, our real selves, standing in the gym, staring back at us with wide, fearful eyes. "What the hell is this?" Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. I reached out to touch the mirror, and as my hand made contact with the cold glass, something horrible happened. The reflections in the mirror began to move on their own, independent of our actions. They grinned wickedly, their faces twisting into grotesque, exaggerated versions of our own. Then, one by one, our reflections stepped out of the mirror, emerging into the gymnasium like twisted doppelgangers. We tried to back away, but the avatars on the screen were frozen in place, unable to move. The doppelgangers advanced, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. "This isn't happening," Tony muttered, his voice shaking. "This can't be real." But it was real as anything could be in the twisted world we had entered. The doppelgangers reached out, their hands cold and clammy as they grabbed hold of us. I felt a sharp, icy pain as my doppelganger's hand latched onto my arm, its grip impossibly strong. "We need to fight back," Mike shouted, but the controller in his hands was useless. The game was no longer in our control. Suddenly, the screen glitched again, and the doppelgangers disintegrated into a cloud of black pixels, swirling around us before being sucked back into the mirror. The gymnasium dissolved, replaced by a dark, featureless void. For a moment, we were left in darkness, the only sound our own panicked breathing. Then, the game world reappeared, but we were no longer in the gymnasium. We were back in the town, standing in front of a dilapidated house that none of us recognized. The house loomed over us, its windows like empty eyes, staring down at us with a malevolent presence. The front door was ajar, swinging slowly as if inviting us inside. A new message appeared on the screen: "Enter if you dare." Despite every instinct screaming at us to stop, to turn off the console and walk away, we couldn't. The game had us in its grip, and we were powerless to resist its pull. "We have to keep going," I said, my voice barely steady. "Maybe there's a way out. Or maybe it's just leading us deeper into this nightmare," Sarah replied, her eyes wide with fear. But we all knew we had no choice. There was no escape from the game's world, no way to shut it off or leave. We had to play or the game would play us. We approached the house, the pixelated ground crunching under our avatars' feet. The closer we got, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The house seemed to breathe, its walls pulsing with a dark energy that made the air thick and heavy. As we crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang, sealing us inside. The interior of the house was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from a few flickering candles scattered around the room. The house was a labyrinth of narrow hallways and twisting staircases, each one leading deeper into the heart of the building. The walls were lined with old, rotting portraits, their eyes following us as we moved through the house. The floorboards creaked underfoot, the sound echoing in the still air like a distant cry. As we explored, the house began to change, shifting and warping around us. Rooms appeared and disappeared at random, doors led to nowhere, and windows showed views of impossible landscapes. Endless voids, burning skies, and dark, twisted forests. "This place is alive," Tony said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's like the game is reacting to us." But the house wasn't just reacting to us, it was hunting us. We soon realized that we weren't alone in the house. Shadows moved in the corners of our vision, flitting just out of sight. At first, we thought it was just a trick of the light, but then we heard it. A faint whispering, like voices carried on the wind, coming from all around us. "Do you hear that?" Jenna asked, her voice trembling. We all nodded, too afraid to speak. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling our ears, with incomprehensible words and phrases. It was like the house was speaking to us, taunting us, driving us mad. We turned a corner and found ourselves in a long hallway lined with doors. Each door was different, some old and decaying, others pristine and new. At the end of the hallway was a large, ornate door, covered in intricate carvings and symbols. "That has to be the way out," Mike said, his voice filled with a desperate hope. But as we approached the door, the whispers grew louder, the voices now screaming in our ears. The hallway began to stretch, the door moving farther and farther away with each step we took. "This isn't right," Sarah said, panic rising in her voice. "We're not getting any closer." Then, without warning, the doors on either side of us burst open, and the shadows emerged. They weren't just shadows anymore. They had form, substance, twisted bodies made of darkness, with hollow, glowing eyes and jagged, claw-like hands. The shadows lunged at us, their claws raking across our avatars, causing the screen to glitch and distort. The pain was real, sharp, and intense, as if we were being torn apart from the inside. "Run!" Tony shouted, but there was nowhere to run. The hallway was collapsing around us, the walls closing in, the shadows closing the distance. Just as the first shadow reached me, I felt a surge of heat, and the screen flashed white. When the light faded, we were no longer in the hallway. We were standing in a small, dimly lit room, the door at the end of the hallway now directly in front of us. The shadows were gone, but their presence lingered, a cold, suffocating fear that pressed down on us. "What just happened?" Jenna asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. "But I think the game is toying with us." We hesitated for a moment, but we knew we had to keep going. We reached for the ornate door, and as I touched the handle, it swung open with a low, creaking sound. Beyond the door was a staircase leading down into the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of decay and rot, and the walls were slick with moisture. The stairs seemed to go on forever, spiraling down into the depths of the earth. "We have to go down," I said, though every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn back. "Are you sure about this?" Tony asked, his voice filled with doubt. "We don't have a choice," I replied, swallowing my fear. "It's the only way." One by one, we descended the stairs, the darkness swallowing us whole. The farther down we went, the colder it became, the walls narrowing until we were practically squeezing through the passage. The whispers returned, but this time they were clearer, more distinct. They weren't just voices, they were our voices, distorted and twisted, saying things we had never said. "Is it reading our minds?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "I think it's worse than that," Tony replied. "I think it's rewriting them." The thought was too terrifying to dwell on, so we kept moving, our footsteps echoing in the darkness. Finally, the stairs ended, and we emerged into a large, cavernous chamber. The chamber was vast, the ceiling lost in shadow. In the center of the room was a massive, pulsing mass of black tendrils, like a beating heart of darkness. The tendrils snaked out from the center, burrowing into the walls and floor, pulsating with a sickly light. As we approached, the tendrils began to move, writhing and twisting like a nest of serpents. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that filled the chamber, echoing off the walls and vibrating through our bodies. The tendrils lashed out, wrapping around our avatars, pulling us closer to the mass. The screen began to distort, the colors bleeding into each other, the images blurring and warping. I can't control it," Mike shouted, frantically pressing the buttons on his controller. The tendrils tightened, crushing us, dragging us into the heart of the darkness. The pain was unbearable, like being torn apart from the inside. The screen flashed, and suddenly we were back in the town, standing in the middle of the street, the house gone, the town empty and silent. The avatars were battered and bruised, their health bars nearly depleted. The tendrils had left a mark on us, not just in the game, but in real life. I could feel the cold, lingering touch of the tendrils on my skin, like a memory that wouldn't fade. "What the hell was that?" Jenna asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, still trying to catch my breath. "But I think we just saw the heart of the game." After what we had just experienced, we were all on edge, our nerves frayed and our minds teetering on the brink of collapse. The game wasn't just playing with us anymore, it was trying to break us. The town was different now, more hostile. The buildings loomed over us, their windows shattered, their walls covered in strange, shifting symbols. The streets were cracked and broken, with dark, bottomless pits where the pavement had collapsed. The sky was a swirling mass of black and red, as if the game itself was decaying, falling apart at the seams. "We need to end this," I said, my voice resolute. "We need to finish the game." "But how?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with despair. "We don't even know what we're up against." "We have to keep moving," Tony said, his eyes darting around the screen. "There has to be a way out." We pressed on, navigating the twisted streets of the town, searching for any clue that might lead us to the final level. The game was relentless, throwing everything it had at us. Monsters, traps, puzzles that made no sense, and constant, unending glitches that distorted our vision and made it nearly impossible to tell what was real and what wasn't. The game seemed to be feeding off our fear, growing stronger with every moment. The glitches became more severe, the world around us flickering and warping, the sounds turning into a cacophony of distorted noise. Then, just when we were on the verge of giving up, we found it, the entrance to the final level. It was a massive, Gothic cathedral, its doors flanked by towering statues of twisted, winged creatures. The building was covered in the same shifting symbols we had seen throughout the game, glowing with an otherworldly light. "This is it," I said, my voice filled with a mixture of dread and determination. "The final level." We stepped inside, the doors slamming shut behind us, trapping us in the darkness. The cathedral was vast, its walls lined with rows of flickering candles, casting long shadows that danced across the floor. The air was thick with the smell of incense and decay, a sickly sweet scent that clung to our throats. In the center of the cathedral was a massive, circular platform, surrounded by a ring of statues. The platform was covered in intricate carvings, depicting scenes of torment and suffering, all centered around a single massive symbol. The same symbol we had seen throughout the game, the symbol that seemed to pulse with a dark, malevolent energy. As we approached the platform, the symbols began to glow, the light intensifying until it was almost blinding. The ground beneath our feet began to shake, and the statues around us came to life, their stone wings unfurling as they turned their hollow eyes towards us. The final boss had arrived. It emerged from the center of the platform, a massive, twisted creature made of shadows and smoke, its form constantly shifting and changing. Its eyes were like burning coals, and its mouth was filled with rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. The creature let out a deafening roar, and the cathedral shook, the candles flickering wildly as the air grew thick with static. The screen glitched and distorted, the image warping and twisting as the creature's form shifted and expanded, filling the screen with its dark, writhing mass. "Get ready," I shouted, gripping my controller tightly. The battle was brutal, the creature lashing out with tendrils of darkness, trying to drag us into its maw. It was like fighting a force of nature, an unstoppable, all-consuming darkness that threatened to engulf us at any moment. We fought with everything we had, dodging its attacks, striking at its weak points whenever we could. But the creature was relentless, its health bar barely budging as it absorbed our attacks, growing stronger with each passing moment. Then, in a moment of desperation, I remembered the heart of the game, the pulsing mass of tendrils we had encountered in the cavern. That was the source of the game's power, the heart of the darkness that had consumed everything. "Hit the symbol," I shouted, realizing what we needed to do. "It's the source of its power." We focused our attacks on the symbol at the center of the platform, and as we did, the creature let out a deafening screech, its form beginning to waver and flicker. The cathedral began to crumble around us, the walls cracking and collapsing as the darkness was sucked back into the symbol, leaving the creature vulnerable. With one final, desperate push, we struck the symbol, and the creature let out a final, anguished roar before disintegrating into a cloud of black pixels. The screen went black, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, the screen flickered back to life, displaying a single message. "Congratulations, you have won." But before we could even begin to process what had happened, the screen flickered again, and the message changed. "One player must stay behind." The room fell silent as we all stared at the screen. The words "one player must stay behind" burning into our minds. The victory we had hoped for was suddenly tainted with dread. The game wasn't going to let us all go, not without one last cruel twist. "What does it mean, one player must stay behind?" Jenna asked, her voice trembling. "It's some kind of sick joke," Tony said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's trying to scare us." But deep down, we all knew the game wasn't joking. It had already shown us what it was capable of, and now it was demanding a final sacrifice. The screen displayed our avatars, Tony, Jenna, Sarah, and me, standing in a line. Below each avatar was a countdown, giving us 30 seconds to make a choice. Only one of us could leave. The other 3 would be trapped in the game forever. "This is insane," Mike said, his voice rising in panic. "We can't do this. We can't just leave someone behind. We don't have a choice," I said, my voice hollow. "If we don't choose, the game will choose for us." The timer ticked down, the seconds slipping away as we stood frozen, unable to make a decision. The pressure was unbearable, the thought of leaving someone behind tearing at my mind. 15 seconds. 10 seconds. The avatars on the screen began to flicker, their faces twisted with fear, mirroring our own. I looked at my friends, my best friends, the people I had grown up with, shared my life with. How could I choose? How could I condemn one of them to an eternity of torment? 5 seconds. For seconds. "I'm sorry," I whispered, barely aware of what I was doing. My hand moved on its own, pressing the button that selected myself as the one to leave. The screen flashed, and everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the floor of my basement, the console still on, but the cartridge was gone. The room was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the TV. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind reeling from what had just happened. I scrambled to my feet, looking around in a panic. My friends were gone. Tony, Jenna, Sarah. None of them were there. "Tony? Jenna? Sarah?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response, just silence. I ran up the stairs, shouting their names, searching the house frantically, but there was no sign of them. It was as if they had never existed. Desperation clawed at me as I rushed back to the basement, hoping, praying that somehow, this was all a nightmare, that they would be there, that we would all laugh it off as some bizarre dream. But when I returned, the basement looked different. The colors were wrong, the textures too smooth, too artificial. It was as if the real world had taken on a pixelated quality, like I was still inside the game. That's when I noticed the console. It was still on, the screen displaying a single message. "The game is not over." A cold dread washed over me as I realized the truth. I hadn't escaped the game. I was still inside it. The game had won, and now it had me. I backed away from the console, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. I had won. I had finished the game. But the game wasn't finished with me. The walls of the basement began to glitch, the colors bleeding into each other, the shapes warping and twisting. The world around me was dissolving, breaking apart like a corrupted file. And then, in the corner of the room, I saw them, my friends. But they weren't really my friends. They were twisted, pixelated versions of them, their faces distorted, their eyes hollow and empty. "James," they whispered, their voices a chorus of static and distortion. "Join us." I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't real, couldn't be real, but it was. The game had taken them, twisted them into something monstrous, and now it was coming for me. I turned to run, but the basement dissolved around me, leaving me in a dark, featureless void. The only light came from the screen in front of me, displaying the final message, "Welcome to the game. You can never leave." I screamed, the sound echoing into the void, but there was no one to hear me. The game had trapped me in its twisted world, and there was no escape. I was alone, lost in a nightmare of pixels and code, with no way out. And as the darkness closed in around me, I realized the terrible truth. The game wasn't just a game. It was a living entity, a malevolent force that fed on fear, on suffering, on the souls of those who dared to play it. It had won. It had taken everything from me, and now it would take me too. The screen flickered one last time, and the final words appeared, "Game over." But for me, the game was only just beginning.